Ahmad ibn Tulun was born a slave. Around 835 AD in Baghdad, he entered the world with no name that mattered, no land, no army, nothing that suggested he would one day rule Egypt outright and dare the most powerful empire on earth to stop him. He grew up inside the Abbasid court at Samarra, trained as a soldier, and educated in the religious schools of Tarsus on the Byzantine frontier. He watched the caliph's ministers play their games of loyalty and betrayal up close, long before he ever held power of his own. In 868 AD, at 33 years old, the caliph sent him to Egypt as a deputy governor, a minor posting, a foothold, nothing more. Within 4 years, he controlled the entire province. He removed the caliph's own tax collector. He seized every dinar flowing through Egyptian finances, and he built a private army of 40,000 soldiers who answered to him alone, not Baghdad. The empire that owned him was too busy to notice. Revolts were tearing through Persia and southern Iraq, and while the caliph's attention was elsewhere, Ahmad quietly turned a province into a kingdom. He founded a new capital outside Fustat. He raised the largest mosque Egypt had ever seen, a building that still stands in Cairo today, one of the only traces of him the modern world remembers at all. By the time Baghdad understood what had happened, it was already too late to undo it. To understand how a former slave could outmaneuver an empire, you have to understand what that empire had stopped paying attention to. By the 9th century, the Abbasid Caliphate stretched from North Africa to the borders of India, too vast for any single ruler to watch closely. Provinces like Egypt were run by governors who answered to Baghdad only as long as Baghdad had the strength to enforce it. The moment that grip loosened, ambitious men moved. This wasn't unique to Ahmad ibn Tulun. Across the African continent, in kingdoms most people in the West have never heard named, rulers were building empires on exactly the same principle: wealth, force, and the simple fact that distant capitals could not watch every frontier at once. Some of these kingdoms controlled gold reserves richer than anything circulating in medieval Europe. Some fielded armies larger than anything a European king could muster at the time. Their courts were wealthier, their trade networks wider, their military campaigns more consequential to the regions around them than most events that made it into European chronicles. And yet almost none of it survived into the history taught outside Africa itself. Ahmad ibn Tulun is only the beginning. What follows are rulers who built and broke empires through gold monopolies enforced by mutilation, battles that ended in pyramids of skulls, and thrones seized through the murder of their own blood, stories with a scale that rivaled anything happening in Europe at the same time, and a body count that dwarfed it. In 1062 AD, a man named Tunka Manin inherited the throne of Wagadou, the kingdom the world would come to know as Ghana, though it bore little resemblance to the modern country carrying that name. He didn't seize his crown through conquest, he inherited it through the Soninke matrilineal line from his uncle, King Bassi. But the empire waiting for him was already staggering in wealth and menace. An Andalusian geographer named al-Bakri wrote about him directly within Tunka Manin's own lifetime. He described a king who commanded 200,000 warriors, 40,000 of them trained archers. A king dressed in solid gold ornaments and ivory armbands, seated in a court surrounded by gold-collared dogs and horses draped in gold thread. But the true source of his power wasn't the army, it was the gold itself and how ruthlessly he controlled it. Every nugget pulled from the region's gold fields belonged to him alone. Common traders were permitted only gold dust. Anyone caught holding an unauthorized nugget lost their hands. He wrapped himself in an aura of the supernatural, letting his subjects believe he could command the spirits of the dead and use that fear to extract tribute from every neighboring kingdom. Salt caravans paid him twice, once entering his empire, once leaving it. For over a decade, it worked. His empire sat richer than most kingdoms in Europe at the time, and almost entirely unknown outside it. Then in 1062 AD, a new threat began pressing in from the north, an army that wanted exactly what he had. The threat had a name, the Almoravids, a fiercely religious Berber movement sweeping down from the Sahara, and they wanted Tunka Manin's gold and his trade routes for themselves. For 14 years, he held them off. His warriors met Almoravid raiders again and again in the deserts of Mauritania, and thousands of invaders died in those sands without ever reaching his capital. For over a decade, the richest kingdom in West Africa proved it could not be taken by force. But armies don't need to win every battle. They only need to win once. In 1076 AD, the Almoravid commander Abu Bakr ibn Umar finally broke through. The city that had housed a court wealthier than most of medieval Europe was looted and burned. Tunka Manin survived the fall, but survival came at a price. He was forced to submit, paying tribute to the very invaders he had held off for 14 years. The gold monopoly that had defined his reign, the fear and reverence that had propped up his authority, all of it began to unravel the moment his capital fell. Within 2 years he was dead. Within a decade, the gold trade that had made his kingdom the envy of 2 continents had collapsed entirely. The Soninke people who had built and defended Wagadou scattered across West Africa, and within 2 generations the empire itself no longer existed. A kingdom richer than European courts of its era, gone almost without a trace from the history most of the world would ever learn. Not every empire fell to the Almoravids. Some were built by them. Yusuf ibn Tashfin was a Sinhaja Berber from the Western Sahara, born around 1009 AD. He rose to command the Almoravid armies under his cousin, founded the city of Marrakesh as a military stronghold in 1070 AD, and within 15 years conquered every Berber tribe from Senegal to the Mediterranean coast. Then a letter arrived from Spain. The Muslim princes of Al-Andalus were being crushed by Alfonso V of Castile, and they begged Yusuf to cross the water and save them. He came with 15,000 men and 6,000 African cavalry, mounted on white Arabian horses, along with war drummers whose deep, booming rhythm was said to shatter the morale of Christian soldiers before a single sword was drawn. On the 23rd of October 1086 AD, he met Alfonso's army at Sagrajaz, the largest Christian force assembled in Spanish history to that point. Yusuf's infantry held the line, his cavalry swept around the flanks and closed in. Alfonso himself was speared and barely escaped alive. By the end of the afternoon, more than 3,000 Christian soldiers lay dead on the field. What happened the next morning is the detail medieval Arab chroniclers remembered most. Yusuf ordered the heads of 24,000 fallen enemies stacked into pyramids across the battlefield used, according to those accounts, as platforms for the dawn call to prayer. He went home to Morocco. The Andalusi princes assumed the war was over. It wasn't. He came back in 1090 AD and conquered every one of them, exiling or executing their kings and folding all of Muslim Spain into an empire that by his death in 1106 AD stretched over 3 million square kilometers. Not every warlord in this history built an empire from nothing. Some inherited one and destroyed themselves trying to rebuild it too fast. Abu al-Hasan Ali took the Marinid throne of Morocco in 1331 AD, inheriting a fractured kingdom and a single obsession: reunifying the entire Western Islamic world, Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, and Muslim Spain under his own banner. He besieged Tlemcen for 8 years, and when the city finally broke in 1337 AD, he had the entire ruling family executed, and their bodies displayed on the walls. He crossed into Spain in 1340 AD to face Alfonso Shi of Castile at the Rio Salado and lost everything in a single day. 20,000 men dead, his treasury gone, his own wife and several of his sons captured on the battlefield. Most rulers would have stopped there. He didn't. 7 years later he marched on Tunis, crushed the ruling dynasty there, and for 1 year controlled North Africa from the Atlantic coast to the edge of Cyrenaica. Then his own son, Abu Inan, rose against him in Morocco. The Black Death struck Abu al-Hasan's army as it marched home to put down the revolt, killing half his soldiers before they ever reached the capital. His son defeated what remained of his broken, plague-ridden force in 1350 AD. Abu al-Hasan fled into the Atlas Mountains, the man who had once ruled from the Atlantic to Cyrenaica, hiding from his own child. He died there in May of 1351 AD alone, abandoned, hunted by his own blood. He had built an empire and lost it inside a single decade, and the son who destroyed him inherited nothing but a kingdom that never fully recovered. 4 men, 4 empires. 4 centuries apart, and yet the same pattern repeats every time. A ruler rises from almost nothing, builds something vast through calculated brutality, and loses it to invasion, to betrayal, or to his own family turning against him. Ahmad ibn Tulun broke an entire province away from the most powerful empire on earth, and built a mosque that still stands in Cairo today. Tunka Manin ruled a kingdom richer in gold than most of medieval Europe, propped up by fear and mutilation, until an army he'd held off for 14 years finally broke through. Yusuf ibn Tashfin built an empire stretching 3 million square kilometers and left behind pyramids of skulls as proof of how he did it. Abu al-Hasan Ali conquered half of North Africa in a decade and died alone in the mountains, hunted by his own son. Between them, these men shaped territory that stretched across 3 continents worth of Africa's coastline and interior, commanded armies larger than most of their European contemporaries, and controlled wealth that rivaled entire kingdoms across the Mediterranean. And almost none of it made it into the history most of the world was taught. this isn't the full list. It's 4 names out of dozens who built and lost empires the same way through gold, fear, and blood, and were left out of the story anyway. If this is the kind of history you want more of, subscribe and drop a comment with which African warlord you want covered next. There is a lot more of this history still buried.